I never thought my life would turn into a story. People would whisper about the kind of family drama you only read in novels or watch unfold on television. But this is my truth, and I need you to hear it from me in my own voice. My name is Sarah. I am a daughter, the youngest child of a wealthy man whose love was always measured in property lines and profit margins. I was 34 when my father died, and even then, a part of me still longed for the kind of father who would look at me not as a disappointment, but simply as his child. I grew up in a house where love was conditional and attention had to be fought for like scraps at the dinner table. My father had 3 children, my 2 older brothers, Matthew and Daniel, and then me, the late arrival, the girl who wasn't supposed to be the heir. From as far back as I can remember, the unspoken rule was clear: sons inherited daughters, complied. My mother, God rest her soul, tried to shield me from that bitter truth, but I saw it in the way father's eyes shone when Matthew got into business school, or when Daniel closed his first deal for the family company. With me, his smile never reached his eyes. I was different. I didn't want to sit in boardrooms or wear a mask of civility while tearing apart competitors. I wanted to build something with my own 2 hands, not just sit in the shadow of my father's empire. When I told him I wanted to study architecture instead of business, his disappointment fell on me like a physical weight. Architecture is a hobby, he said once, his voice sharp as glass. Our family deals in real estate. We own, we do not build. But I studied anyway. I fought for scholarships, worked odd jobs, poured my soul into designs that spoke louder than any financial report. And when I finally graduated, I didn't join the family firm. That was the day my father stopped seeing me as an heir and started seeing me as a problem. I spent years being treated as the black sheep. At family gatherings, Matthew and Daniel would boast about acquisitions, about profit margins, about the next big deal father entrusted them with. They spoke in numbers and percentages, while I sat quietly nursing a glass of wine and biting my tongue. Sometimes Daniel would sneer, "How's the sketching going, Sarah?" as if my passion were nothing more than doodles in a notebook. Father never corrected them. In fact, sometimes he laughed. And every laugh from him felt like another cut across skin already raw. Yet beneath their mockery, I built something of my own. I started small, designing homes for middle-class families, turning abandoned buildings into places of warmth and light. Word spread. My firm grew. Clients began to trust me not because of my last name, but because of my work. And slowly, painfully, I learned to stop waiting for my father's approval. But I would be lying if I told you the little girl inside me didn't still ache for it. Every milestone I reached, I caught myself thinking, if only Dad could see this. If only he would tell me he's proud. Instead, he grew colder, as if my success outside his empire was an insult, not an achievement. By the time he fell ill, we barely spoke. I visited out of duty, not love, and every time I entered his house, my brother's eyes followed me with thinly veiled contempt. They had already decided the narrative: Sarah was out. Sarah had chosen her own path and therefore forfeited her place in the family legacy. I heard the whispers, even from extended relatives. They called me stubborn, ungrateful, rebellious. None of them knew the truth that my father had never given me a place to begin with. When he died, it wasn't grief that consumed me first. It was emptiness. The kind of emptiness you feel when the final door you kept hoping might open is slammed shut forever. Part of me still clung to the hope that even if he hadn't shown it in life, perhaps in death through his will, he would acknowledge me. Perhaps he would leave me something: a property, a token, a line in his handwriting that said, "I did see you, Sarah." But I should have known better. The day of the will reading, my brothers arrived in tailored suits, their wives dripping in jewelry father had probably paid for. They whispered and laughed like conquerors before battle, certain of their spoils. I walked in quietly, my heart hammering, not because I expected riches, but because some small, foolish part of me still craved recognition, still prayed for a line that said, "And to my daughter Sarah, who chose her own path, I leave this." I sat through the reading as the lawyer recited bequests, properties, companies, shares, all neatly divided between Matthew and Daniel. My name was never spoken. Not once. It was as if I had ceased to exist. The humiliation burned hotter than any flame. My brothers smirked, avoiding my eyes as if to say, "See, you were never one of us." Their wives exchanged glances of triumph, already calculating their new estates, their vacations, their status. I wanted to scream, to stand up and demand they look at me, acknowledge me, but my throat closed up. I sat there still as stone, while inside I shattered. When it was over, the lawyer glanced at me with something like pity. That was the worst of all pity. I didn't need it. I didn't want it. What I wanted was justice. And what they didn't know was that while they celebrated, while they gloated over their inheritance, I held a different kind of power. For years, in silence, I had been preparing. I had purchased deeds, acquired properties, made deals under names they never thought to question. While they laughed at me, I had been working, building, reclaiming piece by piece the legacy they thought belonged to them alone. I walked out of that office with my head high, even as my heart bled. They thought they had won, but the war had only just begun. When I left the lawyer's office that day, I carried more than humiliation. I carried a fire in my chest that refused to die out. My brothers might have had father's blessing, but I had something they lacked: the will to survive without him. For years, I had already been walking a path of independence, building a name that wasn't tied to his empire. And it was that very independence that gave me the freedom to play the long game. It started small. My architectural practice was gaining momentum, and every project I finished brought more clients, more trust, more income. Unlike my brothers, I didn't waste my money on status symbols or lavish parties. I invested. I studied the market the way my father had once taught Matthew and Daniel. I watched for opportunities in the shadows, places where arrogance made others careless. When a property tied to father's company quietly went up for sale during one of their restructuring phases, I didn't hesitate. Through a holding company, I bought it. No one even noticed the deed didn't bear my name. Then another, and another. At first it felt like rebellion, but then it began to feel like justice. Piece by piece, I was taking back what had always been withheld from me. I still remember the first night I held a deed in my hands. My fingers trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. That paper wasn't just proof of ownership, it was proof that I wasn't powerless. That even though father had dismissed me, I had carved out a place for myself. I whispered into the silence of my apartment, "This is mine. You cannot take this from me." Over the years, I built a network of trust. Lawyers, brokers, accountants, people who believed in me, not because of my last name, but because I was fair, thorough, and relentless. They kept my secrets safe, helped me create a web of shell companies so complex that even my brother's accountants couldn't trace the connections. I learned to smile at family dinners while knowing the properties they bragged about weren't even theirs anymore. Of course, it wasn't easy. There were nights when exhaustion crushed me, when I cried from the loneliness of carrying such a burden in silence. Nights when I wondered if I had become as calculating as my father, if vengeance was corroding what little softness I had left. But then I would remember the way he looked at me the day I chose architecture, as if I were something broken. I would remember Daniel's sneer, Matthew's laugh, the way they erased me with every word. Those memories hardened me. They became my armor. The deeper I went, the more confident I became. By the time father's health began to fail, I already controlled a significant portion of the family's real estate, more than either of my brothers realized. They strutted around like kings, but their castles were built on sand, and I was the tide coming in. Still, a part of me longed for reconciliation. There were moments late at night when I imagined walking into father's study and laying it all bare. "Look, Dad. Look what I've built. Look how strong I am. Can you finally see me?" But the reality was harsher. Even in his final days, when I visited him in the hospital, his words cut like knives. "If only you had stayed with the family," he said once, his voice weak, but his judgment sharp. "You could have had it all." I left his bedside that night with tears streaming down my face, but beneath the grief was a strange sense of clarity. He would never see me. He would never give me what I craved. If I wanted justice, I would have to take it with my own hands. So I doubled down. I worked tirelessly acquiring properties under names no one could connect to me. I became fluent in the language of contracts, tax codes, loopholes. My brothers saw me as an outsider, a dreamer with sketchbooks, but in reality, I was tightening the noose around their empire. Every purchase was like reclaiming a piece of myself. The old warehouse father had dismissed as worthless. I bought it, renovated it into lofts, and turned it into a thriving community hub. The strip of land Daniel had once mocked in passing as dead weight, I acquired it quietly and sold it years later at 10 times the value. My revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was silent, patient, methodical. And then came the moment that sealed everything. A portfolio of properties that formed the backbone of my father's so-called empire went up for grabs in a complex deal. My brothers were too busy squabbling over who would manage what to notice the buyer swooping in under the radar. That buyer was me. Through a chain of companies so intricate, it would take an army of lawyers to untangle, I signed the papers that transferred power into my hands. I remember standing by the window of my office, the city lights sprawling beneath me, the final deed still warm from the printer. For the first time in my life, I felt not like an outcast, but like a force. They had shut me out of the will, erased me from the story. But the truth was simple. I owned more of the legacy than they ever would. Still, I stayed silent. Timing was everything. I knew the day would come when the truth would be revealed, and I wanted it to land like a hammer. That day would be the will reading, when they sat smug and certain, believing they had won. I would be there, quiet, patient, waiting to show them what justice looked like. And in the silence of my apartment, surrounded by stacks of deeds and contracts, I whispered to myself, "They think I am nothing. Soon they will know I am everything." The day my father died, the house was quieter than I had ever known it. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. The staff moved like shadows through the halls, whispering instead of speaking. My brothers Matthew and Daniel filled the air with their authority, already arguing over arrangements as though father's body were just another asset to be managed. I stood by his bedside just hours before the end. His chest rose and fell in shallow waves, his once commanding presence reduced to a frail figure under crisp white sheets. I wanted to feel sorrow, but all I felt was a complicated knot of anger and grief and resignation. I thought maybe in his last moments he might look at me differently, see the daughter he had overlooked, acknowledge the woman I had become. Instead, his lips moved with effort, whispering words I will never forget. "You should have stayed with the family. You chose wrong, Sarah." That was his last gift to me, a final wound. The kind that scars so deep it becomes part of your very being. I walked out of that room trembling, but I also walked out with resolve. He may have died blind to who I was, but soon the whole world, especially Matthew and Daniel, would see me. The funeral was an exhibition of power. Black limousines lined the driveway, business associates and politicians mingling in their expensive suits, their condolences dripping with insincerity. My brothers stood at the entrance like twin sentinels, shaking hands, accepting sympathy, as though they were kings inheriting a throne. Their wives preened beside them, their jewelry flashing under the sun. I walked past them in a simple black dress, no diamonds, no designer label, just me. Their eyes swept over me with contempt, thinly veiled as pity, as if I were some poor relation clinging to relevance. Let them think that I told myself. Let them sneer. The weight of the folder in my bag, the folder filled with deeds, contracts, and proof of everything I had built, reminded me that appearances meant nothing. After the funeral, the whispers began. Everyone knew the will would be read soon. Everyone assumed the outcome. Cousins, aunts, even distant acquaintances spoke as though it were already decided Matthew and Daniel would inherit everything. Sarah. She would get nothing. It was spoken casually, like a fact as obvious as the sky being blue. And every time I overheard it, the fire in my chest burned hotter. The night before the reading, I sat alone in my apartment, papers spread across the table like battle plans, deeds with my shell company's names on them. Contracts bearing signatures my brothers had ignored. Bank statements, titles, correspondence, every document meticulously organized, every thread leading back to me. I wasn't going into that room as the forgotten daughter. I was going in as the true power behind the empire. Still, I was human. As midnight ticked by, doubt crept in. What if they dismissed it? What if the lawyer found some loophole to ignore my holdings? What if I had built this plan for nothing? I stared at my reflection in the window, the city lights flickering behind me, and for a moment, I saw that same girl who once begged for her father's approval. But then I looked closer. I saw the woman who had survived without it, who had carved her name into deeds they didn't even know were hers. That woman deserved to be heard. I placed everything into a leather folder, my hands steady now. Tomorrow I would carry it into the lion's den. Tomorrow, while Matthew and Daniel gloated while the lawyer read father's words, cutting me out of the legacy, I would bide my time. And then when the room thought it had buried me, I would lay down the truth. The morning of the reading, the atmosphere was suffocating. The lawyer's office was sleek, wood-paneled, smelling faintly of polish and old money. Matthew sat with his arm draped over his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. Daniel whispered something to his wife, who laughed softly, eyes darting toward me with disdain. I sat quietly, the folder resting on my lap, my expression neutral. Inside, my heart pounded like a war drum. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. My father's voice lived again in the words of the document. Cold. Practical. Every property, every account, every asset distributed neatly between my brothers. My name never came. Not once. By the time he finished, Matthew was grinning outright, Daniel straightening in his seat as if he'd just been crowned. I kept my face calm, but inside I was on fire. They thought they had won. They thought I was finished. But they had no idea that my story was just about to begin. The lawyer's voice faded into silence, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the smug exhale of my brothers. Matthew leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, a look of pure satisfaction etched across his face. Daniel adjusted his tie, whispering something to his wife that made her cover her smile with manicured fingers. They didn't even bother to hide it. To them, this was victory. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the folder in my lap. I could feel my pulse thundering in my fingertips, but my face betrayed nothing. I had rehearsed this moment for years, imagined every detail of how it would unfold. They thought the will was the final word. They thought father had buried me with silence. But they were wrong. When the lawyer asked if there were any questions, Matthew was the first to speak. No questions here, he said with mock cheer. It seems everything is in order, as it should be. He turned toward me, then his eyes glinting. I'm sorry, Sarah, truly. But you chose your path. The words stung, but only for a second. I straightened my shoulders, placed the folder on the table, and opened it with deliberate calm. The sound of paper sliding against leather drew every eye in the room. I have something to add, I said softly, but my voice carried. Matthew frowned. Daniel rolled his eyes. This isn't the time for dramatics, Daniel muttered, but I ignored him. From the folder, I withdrew the first deed and placed it flat on the table. Then another, and another, each stamped, signed, undeniable. The lawyer leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he scanned the documents. Matthew's smirk faltered. These, I said, my voice steady now, are the properties father believed still belong to the company. Properties you thought would pass directly to you, but they don't. They belong to me. The color drained from Daniel's face. What the hell are you talking about? I slid another stack of papers forward, contracts, bank transfers, purchase agreements. While you were busy basking in father's approval, I was building. Quietly, patiently. I acquired them through holding companies you never bothered to look into. The warehouses, the downtown offices, even the lakeside development, every single one is under my control. Matthew snatched up a deed, his eyes darting across the page, searching desperately for a loophole. His jaw tightened when he saw the signatures, the seals, the dates. Everything was airtight. You tricked us, he spat. I met his glare without flinching. No. I played the game you tried to lock me out of, and I won. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. These documents are valid, he said slowly. Legally binding. If this portfolio is accurate, then a significant portion of the estate no longer belongs to the company or its heirs. It belongs to Miss Sarah. The room exploded. Daniel slammed his fist on the table, his wife hissing in his ear. Matthew accused the lawyer of collusion of fraud. Their voices rose harsh and desperate, while I sat in silence, letting their outrage wash over me like a storm that no longer frightened me. For once, I wasn't the forgotten daughter, the quiet outsider. I was the force they had underestimated, and now they were choking on the weight of it. Finally, I spoke again. All my life you treated me as if I was nothing. Father erased me from his will because I chose a different path. But while you mocked me, I was working. While you thought I was out of the game, I was taking back what mattered most. And now when you look at the legacy you thought was yours, you'll see my name stamped across it instead. Matthew's face was crimson, his composure cracking. You can't do this. You don't have the stomach for it. Father wanted us to carry on his legacy, not you. I leaned forward, my gaze sharp as a blade. Father is gone, and his legacy doesn't belong to you. It never did. It belongs to the one who built it, protected it, and fought for it. That's me. The lawyer nodded gravely, confirming the truth neither of them could deny. Their empire, their triumph, their inheritance, it was crumbling before their eyes. For the first time, silence fell. Matthew and Daniel sat back, stunned, their arrogance stripped away. I gathered my papers, calmly sliding them back into the folder. I didn't need to shout or gloat. The deeds spoke louder than any words ever could. As I stood to leave, I looked at them one last time. You erased me from Father's will, but you'll never erase me from his legacy. Remember that. And with that, I walked out, my heels clicking against the polished floor, the weight of years of humiliation finally lifted. Behind me, the sound of my brother's anger and disbelief faded, replaced by something far sweeter: silence. In the days after the will reading, the world around my brothers began to shift in ways they never anticipated. At first, they tried to recover, convincing themselves that what had happened was just a minor setback. They spoke boldly in public, assuring business partners and relatives that they were still in control. But behind closed doors, cracks were spreading fast. Investors started asking questions. Banks reviewed their loans and suddenly became cautious. Without the properties I controlled, their balance sheets looked thinner, their claims weaker. Their arrogance had made them sloppy, and now every misstep was being illuminated under the harsh light of reality. I didn't have to lift a finger. The same pride that had made them mock me was now dragging them under. Daniel, the hothead, lashed out at employees until people began resigning in waves. Matthew tried to negotiate with me in private, his voice still laced with superiority, as if he believed I might pity him enough to give something back. I looked him in the eye and said only, "I owe you nothing." That silence between us, heavy and final, was the moment he realized he had lost me forever. Their wives, once draped in jewels and smug smiles, started appearing less and less at social events. Whispers floated through the city, rumors of financial strain, of desperate measures of power slipping away. The empire they thought Father had secured for them was unraveling, and the one they had dismissed, the daughter, the outcast, was standing taller than ever. But victory didn't taste the way I thought it would. Yes, there was satisfaction in watching their downfall, in knowing I had reclaimed what was mine. Yet beneath the triumph there was also sorrow. I had wanted justice, and I had achieved it, but at the cost of a family that could never be healed. I had dreamed once of a father who might look at me with pride, brothers who might see me as an equal. That dream had died with him maybe long before. What I gained was something different, something harder but truer: freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living under the weight of their contempt or the shadow of Father's disappointment. I was living on my own terms, with my own name carved into the deeds of the empire they thought I couldn't touch. Sometimes late at night, I sit with the folder that started it all, running my hands over the papers like old scars. They are proof of my battle, but they are also proof of my survival. Each deed is a reminder that when the world told me I was nothing, I chose to fight for my worth instead of waiting for someone else to grant it to me. As for my brothers, they remain bitter, blaming me for their failures instead of facing their own mistakes. But I've stopped letting their bitterness define me. Their downfall is theirs to carry, not mine. My revenge is complete not because I destroyed them, but because I refused to let them destroy me. And so, to you listening now, I share this. If you have ever been cast aside, erased, or told, you are not enough, remember this story. Remember that silence is not the same as defeat. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not in shouting or striking back, but in building yourself so strong that no one can ignore you. I was left out of the will. I was dismissed as irrelevant. But in the end, I became the one holding everything they valued most. Not because my father gave it to me, but because I took it back with my own hands. If my story touched something inside you, if you've ever carried wounds of betrayal or longed for vindication, I ask you, share this video. Let it remind someone else that they are not powerless. Like this story. If it resonated, subscribe for more truths spoken from the heart and leave a comment telling me what battles you've survived. Your voice matters just like mine does now. Because the lesson I carry and the one I leave with you is simple: family can betray you, but your worth is never theirs to decide.